It was the spring of 1887 when the last frost clung to the edge of the high plains like a man refusing to let go. Snow had stopped falling 2 weeks earlier, but the wind still came down from the mountains sharp and mean, dragging with it the memory of winter. Willow, Wyoming sat squat and hunched in the wide basin of dry grass and low pine, its streets worn soft from wagon wheels and sorrow. The house stood half a mile east of town, crooked on the ridge like it wanted to turn away. It was not much, 2 rooms, a lean minus kitchen, a stove that smoked if the wind turned just so. No curtains, no porch, just bare boards whooping from rain and time. On that morning the door creaked open just before light. A woman stepped out and pulled Hirsch, all close against the chill, her fingers white at the knuckles.
Her name was Maura Fletcher.
She did not look back at the bed where her children still slept, curled close for warmth like fox pups in a den.
She stared out into the lowland, where fog moved slow and low, rolling like breath across the ground.
The land didn't care that she was cold, or tired, or that her husband had been gone nearly 2 years, buried in a shallow grave 2 counties south where the fever took him fast. She had dug the hole herself, sweating unshivering, and left without a stone. She gripped the handle of the rusted axe and stepped toward the woodpile. Her boots were split at the toes and draped in strips of cloth. Each step sank into the thawing mud, her breath a pale thread in the air. She split 3 logs before the pain in her shoulder caught fire, but she didn't stop. Pain meant something was still working. That was a comfort of sorts. Inside, her boy coughed. The younger one, Jonah, he had not taken to the winter well. Always thin, always a little behind, and now pale in the cheeks with a fever that came and went like a bad thought. She had sent letters to her sister back east, but got no reply. Maybe her sister never forgave her for leaving. Maybe no one did. The sun never really rose at day, it just got brighter around the edges of the clouds. Wind tugged at her skirts as she dragged the logs inside. She knelt by the stove and fed the fire with care. The smoke curled in the air like it was thinking of something sad. Maura crouched there a long time, her hand on the stove's belly, eyes fixed on nothing. The boy moaned in his sleep. The older girl, Ruth, stirred and sat up. Her hair was tangled and her eyes still swollen from dreams. "You'll fetch water," the girl said. Maura nodded. Ruth wrapped herself in a coat that used to belong to her father. The sleeves still hung past her fingertips, but she was tall for 12 and getting taller. Maura watched her go, then turned to Jonah. His skin was hot under her palm. Too hot. Again. She wrung out a cloth and laid it on his brow. He didn't stir. By midday, the wind had risen. Dust scuttled across the packed earth like insects in flight. The house shuddered as the gusts shoved against it. Maura stared out the small window above the sink. The clouds were thick and low, the same color as regret. She wrapped a blanket tighter around her boy and listened for her daughter's return. The water well was far, but the walk back could drag if the buckets were heavy. Time slowed. She began to count breaths. Her own. Jonah's. The slow tick of the wall clock. When the knock came, it startled her. 2 short raps. Then a pause. Then 3 more. Not a neighbor. Neighbors just walked in. She crossed the room and opened the door just a crack. A man stood there, his coat torn at the shoulder, blood dry against the collar. He didn't speak, just looked past her toward the stove. His eyes were gray, and in them was something familiar, something broken. "I don't want trouble," she said. He took off his hat and held it in both hands like it might shatter. "Mom," he said, voice hoarse from dust, "I reckon I need a doctor or a shovel, and I ain't much good at either." She looked at him, really looked. His boots were covered in the same mud as hers. He was shaking, but standing. Not a threat. Not yet. She stepped aside. The man crossed the threshold slow, like he wasn't sure the floor would hold him. He glanced once toward the boy wrapped in quilts, then moved to the far wall and eased himself down, one hand pressed to his ribs. His coat pulled back, and Maura saw the stain on his shirt dark and spreading. "You shot?" she asked. "No, Mom," he said. "Horse threw me down a ravine west of here. Cut a branch on the way. Broke some things, I think." "You work for?" He nodded. "Since yesterday morning." She knelt beside the stove and grabbed the kettle. The water was nearly gone. Ruth still hadn't come back. Mara felt her stomach twist. "You got a name?" she asked. "Elias," he said. Elias Scott. She didn't offer hers. Just tore a strip from the old muslin apron and poured the last of the warm water over it. She handed it to him without a word. He pressed it to his side, jawed. The boy whimpered. Mara was at his side before she thought about it, checking his forehead again, brushing damp curls back from his face. His cheeks were to read. She needed fever root or a doctor, and she had neither. Just hope that was wearing thin. Elias watched, his back against the wall. "That your boy?" She nodded once. "He looks like you," he said. She didn't answer. Jonah stirred again, muttering in his fever. His hand twitched, reaching for something that was there. "My daughter went for water," Mars said, still facing the bed. "Chesley shall come," Elias said, though he couldn't have known that. Maybe he was just saying it because he needed to believe someone would come for something. The wind picked up again, screaming around the corner of the house like it was looking for a way in. Mara stood and moved to the door. Still no sign of Ruth. No shape on the horizon. Just the heavy gray sky and the ragged trees bowing eastward.
"Why do you come here?" she asked without turning.
"Didn't know where I was," Elias said. "Just kept walking. Saw the smoke." "You from around here?" "No," he said. "South. Used to run cattle before the banks took the land. Been drifting some since."
Ma studied the trees. She counted them like she always did when the silence got too tight.
11 on the rise. From more by the creek. "You got people?" she asked. "Used to," Elias said, after a long time. "Wife died in childbirth. Boy didn't last the night." Mar turned then. Something in her eyes shifted like a gate coming off its hinge. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away either. Not until she saw the shape moving through the wind minus blown grass. A small figure, head bent, buckets banging against her legs. "Ruth," Mara breathed. She opened the door and stepped out, boots sinking into the mud. Ruth stumbled the last few feet, cheeks red, coat soaked through. "Rope on the bucket snapped," she said, breathless. "Had to climb down."
Mora took the buckets, set them aside, and pulled the girl close.
Held her tight and didn't speak. Ruth didn't fight it. Just stood there, face pressed to her mother's shoulder. Elias looked away. Inside, the boy coughed again. The moment broke. Mara stepped back. "Get dry," she said to Ruth. "Then boil this water." The girl nodded and moved inside. Mara lingered a moment, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. She looked out over the land, the house behind her, the man inside bleeding slow and quiet. She didn't know what was coming next, but something had shifted. A stranger had knocked, and she had let him in. Subscribe and walk the thin line between law and survival. That night the wind howled harder than it had all winter, though the calendar said spring. It pressed against the house like a wild thing that wanted in. The boards creaked and moaned. The stovepipe rattled, but the fire held steady, and inside there was lightened warmth and breath. Elias lay on a cot Ruth had dragged in from the barn. He hadn't spoken much since dusk, the pain keeping him quiet. He gritted through it, sometimes closing his eyes, sometimes watching Mara move around the room like she'd done it all 1,000 times before. She had. She brought him another damp cloth, this one steeped in willow bark. Her hands moved with the kind of gentleness that came from exhaustion, not sentiment. "You should try to sleep," she said. "I've tried," he muttered. He looked thinner in the lamplight. His hair was flecked with gray, not from age, but from dust and grief. His jaw was rough with beard, but his eyes, though tired, stayed sharp. "Your boy's fever still climbing?" She nodded, wrapping the cloth again. "Sometimes it breaks by morning, and sometimes it doesn't." She didn't answer. Didn't like saying things that might give death too much shape. Instead, she walked to the stove and stirred the pot shed, set there hours before beans and whatever fat was left from last week's pork shoulder. Not much, but it would stretch. Elias coughed and shifted. "Aye, ain't he looking to stay long?" Mara glanced at him over her shoulder. "Didn't say you were." He gave a small, tight smile. "You don't talk like most women I've met." "I talk like someone who's lived through most of 'em," she said flat. A silence hung between them then. It wasn't unfriendly, just tired. Real. After a while she handed him a cup of broth. Their fingers brushed. He winced from the movement but held the cup steady. "My wife used to mix to that tasted like wood shavings," he said. "God rest her." Mara raised an eyebrow. She was a fine woman, kind, pretty too, just never took to the kitchen. "You eat what you're given," Mara said, taking the cup back when he finished. "That's the truth." The lamplight flickered, casting shadows that leaned long against the walls. Ruth was asleep beside Jonah, her hand resting protectively on his chest. Mara sat down finally in the rocker near the stove. Her hands were raw from splitting wood, her back sore from carrying too much. Still, she didn't close her eyes. Elias watched her. After a long stretch, he spoke again. "Before the bank took the ranch, I used to ride fence every morning. Same trail, same gate, but I liked it. That kind of repetition gave me peace." Mara didn't say anything, but she stopped rocking. He continued, voice lower now. "After my boy died, I kept checking that gate for months. Like maybe HED come walking up the trail. No sense in it, but grief's funny that way." She didn't look at him, just stared into the fire. "I buried a man in Kansas," he said, quiet. "Lost worth much, but he was mine. Took 6 days to die. He begged me not to leave him, and I didn't." Elias nodded. "Hardest thing in the world. Watching someone you love fall apart right in front of you." The room felt still after that. Even the wind quieted as if it too was listening. She stood after a while, added another log to the fire. The smell of smoke and dash settled deep into the walls. "You're not healed," she said, not as a question. "No, Mom. You'll need to stay a few days. You've got cracked ribs and maybe worse." He looked at her. "That won't cause trouble." She met his gaze. "There's no one left to care what I do." He studied her face, the way her jaw tightened when she spoke, the way her eyes always stayed moving like she didn't trust anything to stay in place. "I'll help where I can," he said. "When I'm able." She gave a single nod.
Morning comes early.
"Always does." Outside, the wind began to rise again, but inside the room held steady. By the 4th morning the wind had softened. The land outside still wore the gray hush of late spring, but the bite was gone from the air. Ruth fed the chickens and broke ice from the trough with a rock while Mara watched Elias slimp his way to the woodpile. Jaw set tight, breath shallow. He hadn't asked to work, just picked up the axe like it was owed. He split 6 logs before the pain doubled him over. Mara came to his side, but he waved her off, panting. "I've been hurt worse," he said through gritted teeth. "Doing what?" "Living." She left him to it. He rested a long time after, sitting on the porch with a cup of weak coffee, watching Ruth hang linens on the line. The girl didn't speak much to him, but she didn't shy away either. That evening she handed him a bowl of stew without being asked. He said thank you. She nodded once, like she'd expected him to. Inside, Jonah's fever had begun to break. His sleep grew easier. Mara still sat beside him most nights, wiping his brow, whispering things low and private. Elias never asked what. He just listened to the sound, soft breathing, the creak of the rocker, the rustle of blankets. And sometimes, late when the fire was low, Mara would sing to her boy, a threadbare lullaby that seemed to hold the night together. After supper one evening, Elias stood and cleared the dishes. Mara looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "You're a guest," she said. "I'm a man who's eaten for nights under your roof," he said. "It's past time I earned it." They worked side by side at the basin, the quiet between them growing less heavy with each night. Elias told her about the cottonwood trees on his old land and how they decreak in the wind like old women gossiping. Mara laughed at that just once, a dry, surprised sound. He caught it like it meant something. She asked about the ranch next. He described the layout, the sloping pasture, the barn HED built with his brother who'd gone out west and never returned. He spoke of cattle prices and bad weather in the day they lost 1/3 of the herd to blizzard. He didn't speak of the graves. Mara listened while folding towels, her eyes on the cloth but her mind elsewhere. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "My husband thought we'd last," she said. "Said he could make a farm out of rock and prayers. Turned out the land didn't care much for either." Elias nodded. It dawned. They looked at each other then, something in the silence between them shifting again, not romance, not yet, but recognition, like two people standing on the same edge, each surprised to find the other still upright. That night, when Joan awoke with a dry throat and clear eyes, Mara wept. Not loud, just quiet tears she wiped away before anyone could see. She held him close while he drank, whispering, there now, over and over, like the words might hold. Elias heard the sound through the wall. He didn't sleep after. The next day brought clear skies. They took Jonah outside wrapped in blankets, just for a little while. He squinted against the light, weak but alive, the air smelling of thaw and pine. You said you ran cattle, Mara said later as they worked in the small garden plot. Her hands moved confidently through the dirt. You know anything about sick calves? Enough, Elias said. There's a neighbor, old man down the ridge. He lost 2 calves to fever last month. If you're strong enough to ride, he might pay you to look. You vouch for me? She stood and looked at him long. I'd say you ain't dead yet, she said. And you can swing an axe. That's more than most. He smiled. Later, Ruth asked him to check the barn door that kept swinging open. He went with her, his limp still visible but less pronounced. She pointed to the loose hinge and he nodded. You're a quiet one, he said, squatting down with the nail. I watch, she said. Good. That's how folks learn. She handed him the hammer without being told. For the first time, she smiled. Elias drove the nail in firm and sure. The door stayed shut. By the time the grass turned green again and the first shoots of wild onion pushed up along the creek bed, Elias had been at the Fletcher homestead nearly 3 weeks. His sides still ached when he twisted too quick, but he could ride, and he did down to the neighbor's pasture and back with news of sickness, births, lost tools, found calves. Folks started waving at him when he passed. A few nodded first. He slept in the barn now, by his own choosing. Lamar never asked it, said it gave him purpose, and besides, a man ought to be close to the horses if he planned to work. He kept the tack in order, swept the stalls, fixed what needed fixing. The place began to look less forgotten. Mara watched all this without comment, but something had softened in her, and it showed in small things: an extra portion of stew, a second coffee cup set out in the morning, the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. But he noticed. Elias noticed everything now. One evening, while Ruth and Jonah were inside playing dominoes, Elias handed Mara a letter he'd carried since February. The envelope was torn at the corners, folded too many times. She looked at him, confused. It's from the land office in Cheyenne, he said. I never opened it. Why give it to me? He scratched at his jaw, suddenly unsure. Because if it's bad news, I'd rather hear it from someone who tells the truth. She turned the letter in her hands but didn't open it, just held it for a long moment, then slid it into her apron pocket. They didn't speak about it again that night. The next morning Mara was gone early. Left a note for Ruth, said she'd ride into town for supplies. It was a lie. She rode to the post office and sat outside with the letter in her lap, staring at the dust on her boot. Then she tore it open. The ranch Elias had lost his father's land was now under foreclosure. There would be no claim left to return to, no appeal to be made. It was gone in the quiet, permanent way that land disappears when paper decides its worth. She rode home slow. When she returned, Elias was chopping fence posts, shirt off, sweat running down his spine in thin rivulets. He looked up when she came near, and she handed him the letter back without speaking. He opened it, read the line that ended what had been his whole world. Then he handed it back. Well, he said, I suppose that's that. You knew. I figured, he said. Just needed to see it on paper, I guess. They stood a long time in the field, not touching, not saying much. Then Mara said, You could stay. Elias blinked. She went on, voice steady. There's work here. The barn needs mending. Chickens don't raise themselves. And the boy needs someone who can whittle a toy that won't fall apart. He smiled a little at that. Only if you want to, she added quickly. I ain't offering charity. He looked out over the land. Wind rippled through the tall grass. The roof needed patching. The fence leaned like a drunk. The world was still hard and mean. but for the first time in a long while, it felt like something worth waking up for. "Then I reckon he'll stay," he said. She didn't nod, didn't smile, just turned and walked toward the house. But she left the door open behind her. That summer came in fast and dry. Dusk clung to everything, and even the birds seemed quieter. Elias worked dawn to dusk without complaint. He and Ruth rebuilt the henhouse, dug a new drainage trench behind the barn, and patched the fence line with scavenged wire. Jonah followed close behind whenever he was strong enough, asking questions, pointing at tools, pretending he was a ranch hand. Elias let him. He never slept inside the house, not once. But every morning, Ma found coffee waiting on the stove before she was fully dressed, and every evening when the chores were done, she and Elias would sit in the dirt near the porch, watching the horizon cool from gold to gray. They talked more now, not always about the past. Sometimes about seed varieties, or how long before the well might go dry again, or what to do about the coyote prints near the coop. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. Sometimes she'd hand him a piece of cornbread and sit beside him until the mosquitoes came out. But something waited between them. Not unsaid, just not yet. One evening late in August, a rider came up the trail fast. Dust rose behind him, sharp and urgent. Mara tensed. Elias saw it in her shoulders. The rider was young, maybe 17, in a suit too small and the hat too new. He dismounted awkwardly and handed Mara a folded letter. "It's from your brother minus and minus law," he said. "From Chicago." Mara's face went pale. She stepped back as if the paper burned. "Thank you," Elias said, stepping forward, and the boy nodded, took a drink from the trough, and rode off without waiting. Inside, Mara unfolded the letter at the table. Her hands trembled. She read in silence, then sat down hard. Ruth hovered near the stove, uncertain. "What is it?" Elias asked. Mara didn't look up. "He wants the children. Says I've done enough damage. Says a court could decide." Silence. Elias stepped closer. "Did he help when your husband died?" "No." "When Jonah was sick?" "No." "Then HES got no right." Mara looked up, eyes sharp with something Elias hadn't seen in her before. Fear, yes, but also fury. The kind that comes from being pushed too long. "HES got money," she said. "He'll hire a lawyer. I don't have anything but land we haven't paid taxes on the last name no one remembers." Elias knelt beside her. "You've got this place. You've got them. You got me." Her face broke, just a little. She pressed her palms to her eyes and breathed deep. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Elias took his father's old rifle from the barn and laid it on the table. Mara sat across from him, staring. "I won't let anyone take them," he said, "even if they say I'm unfit." "You're the only mother they've got," he said, "and I know a mother when I see one." She reached across the table then and took his hand. It was the first time. In the days that followed, they rode to town together, sat in the sheriff's office, went to the courthouse, spoke to a clerk who owed Elias a favor. The letter was real, but the threat turned out mostly smoke. Nothing filed yet, no judge summoned. Just a man far away, full of bitterness and a need to control what he never cared to protect. Still, it changed something. Mara didn't leave the house without checking the windows twice. She slept lighter, but Elias was there now, beside her more than not. And slowly the fear quieted. One Sunday evening, Mara stepped outside with a bundle in her arms. She had sewn a shirt from a bolt of cotton she had found buried in the old trunk. She held it out. "It's not much," she said. Elias turned it in his hands. "It's the first new thing I've had in years." She smiled then, and for the first time he reached up and touched her cheek. She didn't pull away. That night, after Jonah had fallen asleep under the stars and Ruth had gone to bed without a word, Mara stood at the door to the barn. "You're welcome inside," she said. Elias didn't answer. He just followed her in. The first frost came early that year. September had barely settled before the nights turned brittle, and the grass crisped at the edges. Elias winterized the barn without being asked, checked the roof twice, mended cracks in the walls with strips of old canvas and pine tar. He moved his bedroll from the loft into the main house the night the first snow threatened, but no one said anything about it, not Ruth, not Jonah, not Mara. It just happened, like rain or fire or spring. The days fell into rhythm. Morning chores, lessons at the table with the children, a pot of beans simmering low by noon. Elias started building a proper chicken coop, not the patchwork one they kept standing with wire and stubbornness. He carved Jonah a slingshot, showed Ruth how to sand wood with the grain. Mara cooked more, even when supplies ran thin. Sometimes she sang under her breath without knowing, and sometimes she touched his arm just because she wanted to. One cold morning, while Ruth was washing linens and Jonah lay under a blanket with a wheezy cold, Elias sat at the table tracing something into the edge of the wooden bench with a penknife. Mara came in from hanging meat in the smokehouse, brushing ice from her sleeves. "What are you doing?" she asked. He smiled without looking up. "Just making something last." She stepped closer. A small carving was taking shape in the wood grain, a single tree, bare branches stretching up like arms. Below it, he had etched initials. "Yours?" she asked. "Yours too," he said quietly. She was quiet a long time. "You don't have to," she said. "You don't owe us." He set the knife down and looked at her, his voice sure now. "It's not about owing. It's about choosing." That night, Mara found a box beneath the bed, Elias's few belongings folded neat. A photograph of a woman and child long gone. A Bible with the cover worn soft. A pekeknif, a pencil, and a folded drawing of a house with 2 chimneys and a porch that wrapped all the way around. Later, as they sat by the fire, Ruth asleep and Jonah snoring through the tail end of his cold, Mara asked about the sketch. "I used to dream of building it," Elias said, "before everything went wrong. Figured if I ever had a second chance." She turned the drawing in her hands. "You still could." "With what?" "Wood. Time. Will. You'd help?" "It'd hold the nails in my teeth." He laughed then, full in from the chest. She hadn't heard him laugh like that before. It was that sound she thought of 2 weeks later when the man arrived. Dismaning, slow, codifying, head to stiff. The wind quieted as he walked up the path. Mara stood in the doorway, Ruth behind her. The man tipped his hat. "Mrs. Fletcher?" She nodded once. "And Mr. Alden. Sent by your brother minus and minus law." Ruth stiffened. Mara didn't move. "I've come to speak about the children," he said. "You can turn around and ride back," Elias said, stepping out from the barn, rifle in hand, not pointed, but ready. Mr. Alden didn't flinch. "I have paperwork." "Paper don't raise children," Mara said. "Your brother minus and minus law says you're unfit. My children are fed. One. Safe." "And the man living here? He your husband?" "Not yet," Elias said, stepping closer. "But I reckon that's changing." Mara's hand brushed his. Mr. Alden studied them both, weighing something. "You'll have to fight this legally." "Then we will," Elias said. "And I reckon you should take that answer back." The man lingered a moment longer, then nodded once and turned. They watched until he disappeared over the ridge. Later, inside, Elias sat beside Mara at the table, the fire crackling soft behind them. Ruth brought over a box her mother's sewing tin and placed it down with a smile. Mara opened it slowly. Inside was her husband's wedding band, long kept out of sight. She took Elias's hand, slid the ring onto his finger. "I'm not promising ease," she said. "Just that I won't walk away." "I wouldn't let you," he said. Outside, snow began to fall, light at first, then steady. Inside, the stove burned strong. The house, long worn and weathered, felt like a home again. Winter settled in deep and slow, pressing its weight across the plains. Snow came often but soft, like the land had finally tired of being cruel. The nights were cold, but the house held heat now, thick quilts, sealed windows, the warmth of bodies that belonged to one another. Elias stayed, not as guest or help, but as husband in truth, though no preacher had come nor paper been signed. It didn't matter. The vows had been spoken in work and watchfulness, in the way he woke first and banked the fire, in the way Mara laid her hand on his back without thinking, in the hush that came over the room when Ruth or Jonah laughed. They kept on as they had mending, planting, teaching, feeding chickens, patching boots, praying the well woodland freeze solid. Jonah got stronger with each week. Ruth, Nearly 13, was more woman than girl now, and sometimes when she looked at Elias, there was a strange peace in her eyes, like Shed finally exhaled after a long time holding her breath.
In January, Elias built a cradle,
He said it was for the neighbor's wife, who was due come spring.
but Mara saw how he measured it, slow and careful, how he sanded every edge to smoothness.
He lined it with wool and set it by the fire, even before anyone asked.
A week later, Mara stood out behind the barn, the sky low and white.
She had her hands on her hips in her coat and buttoned despite the cold. Elias came up behind her, curious. She turned to him, not smiling, not crying, just shining in the face the way only truth can do. "Am with child," she said. He didn't speak for a moment, just stepped forward, pressed his forehead to hers, and breathed in like it was the first air Hed had in years. That night, they told the children. Ruth blinked twice and nodded, quiet and steady. Jonah laughed out loud and said, Hed eats the baby how to trap rabbits and not be afraid of storm. The next day, Elias dug out a strip of land near the house, marked it with stakes. "Come spring," he said, "we'll start building the port."
Around the whole house? Mara teased.
"Every side," he said. "So no matter where the wind blows, we'll always have a place to sit." The letter from Chicago never came again. No court summons. No stranger in a suit.
Only the occasional parcel from town and one note from the neighbor's boy, asking if Elias could help brand in March.
They saved what they could, dried fruit in the cellars, stitched tiny clothes from worn linen. Mara moved slower now, and Elias scolded her for lifting too much, only to find her splitting kindling the next morning. She gave him a look that said she'd been doing this long before him. He smiled and held the bucket anyway.
By the time the ground began to thaw, the cradle had been moved to the corner of their room. Jonah had carved a small wooden horse and left it inside on a bit of cloth.
Ruth embroidered a single blue star into the lining.
And one morning in April, before the light had risen fully, Mara woke Elias with her hand in his.
"It's time," she said. He never left her side. It was a long birth. Not easy, but not dangerous either.
Ruth brought towels. Jonah waited outside with the horses, pacing like a man twice his age.
And then, just before noon, the cries came high and fierce and strong. "Hey, girl." Mara held her first, skin slick and new, hair dark like Elias's, mouth open like she had something to say. They named her June.
Because she was the promise of warmth after so much cold.
Later that evening, Elias stepped outside.
The wind had died down. The sun was low, and the snow along the fence line had finally melted to show the bare earth beneath.
The trees on the ridge were budding.
Birds moved in pairs.
He held the door open a while, just listening.
Behind him, Jonah laughed. Mara whispered. The baby cried and then hushed. He stepped back inside, closed the door behind him, and for the first time in a long, long while, there was nothing left to run from.
Only the life ahead.
Subscribe and see what rises with the next sun.